The scintillating math of superstability. Closed kinematic chains, CKCs, in action. This is a mock-up of my Halloween costume from several years back. I was working in a K-8 school at the time, and I took an old t-shirt and a bunch of different colored markers, and I wrote math equations all over the t-shirt, and I wore it to school. During the day, I noticed that I was getting two different kinds of reactions. One was people would look at me and say, "What's with the t-shirt?" And a whole other category of people would look at me and say, "Ugh, that is scary." So I know that just the word math can make people a little uncomfortable. And what I want you to just think about is don't worry about it. Nothing's going to be difficult. You're not going to need to do any equations here. Just rest, relax, take it easy, enjoy the ride. I promise you it will be worth it. Giving our presentation a little bit of context here, I'll say that for some of us studying biotensegrity for several years, we've known that we are sort of on the outer edges of mainstream science, not very well recognized or accepted at this point. However, in 2018, in March, the Wyss Institute at Harvard University came out with this really exciting statement. Their new multi-scale modeling approach reaffirmed that tensegrity is a fundamental determinant of living systems at all size scales. This is work that was done by Charles Riley and Donald Ingber. And with this, to my mind, tensegrity in biology, or biotensegrity, went from being an interesting hypothesis to a viable theory on the leading edge of biology. So, it was a whole new ballgame for those of us in the field. But what is tensegrity? Now, I'm going to assume that if you're watching this, you've already done a bit of work in the field. You have some familiarity with the concept, perhaps with the definitions that Buckminster Fuller and Kenneth Snelson used for defining tensegrity, that perhaps you've built a few of your own tensegrity structures, preferably at least some of them with non-extensible cables. And so I'm not going to get into that right now because we could do an entire presentation. There have been entire books written on tensegrity itself. But right now, we're just going to look at tensegrity and consider it as a win-win collaboration between tension and compression. When we look at tensegrity in the body and in the rest of all living things, biotensegrity, we're considering these physical models that we build as energy state models for the living structures. We recognize that any living thing is going to involve a dynamic equilibrium of this co-arising duality of push and pull in a win-win configuration. Danielle Claude Martin put it this way: tensegrity maximizes the advantages of tension and minimizes the drawbacks of compression. And do take a look for her book on biotensegrity. It's really wonderful. So, what are the mathematics that are associated with tensegrity? Well, we will get to this in a moment, but first, what we're going to do is give you a wider view of some of the things that we've been looking at lately in the field. And we're calling these the new frontiers of biotensegrity. Um, and we've been looking at the work of Robert Connolly, Eric Demain, Ben Roth, Alan Back, Placide Ferreira, Albert Harris, Joseph Clinton, and several others. It's not that this math is necessarily new. Some of it's been around for several decades or even longer, but we're just putting it all together in the context of applying it to the theory behind what we're doing in biotensegrity. These new frontiers reveal that the mathematics of tensegrity are associated with superstability, kinematic indeterminacy, infinitesimal rigidity, inherent error canceling abilities, CKCs, a broader definition of joints than we've been thinking about, and broader definitions for struts and for cables. Now, we can't get into all of these little things today, but we're just going to focus mostly on the kinematic indeterminacy, the superstability, and the CKCs. And the question is, why do we care? Why does it matter? Well, from our perspective, this stuff that's been coming out of the mathematical world is very different from what's traditionally used mathematically in biomechanics and to model living things. The math presents a new range of possibilities for explaining how tensegrity relates to biology. And one thing we're looking at is how a lot of bodywork and movement therapy approaches that have been considered unprovable or baseless, things such as light touch or non local events, for example, how an acupuncture needle in the ear could affect pain in the hip or a skin condition or the function of a liver, right? These kinds of non local events become supported by this advanced mathematical theory. So it's very exciting. Now, speaking of that traditional biomechanics perspective and the math associated with it, we'll take a step back and just say that it involves a lot of calculating. It involves a lot of static linear analysis, and it involves a lot of assumptions. This image is from Borelli's De Motu Animalium from 1680, and you can see how the machine models of the day, which were getting more and more advanced all the time, were imagined to be inside the human body. And in a couple of slides, you'll see a more modern representation that pretty much uses the same ideas. This is probably the math you hate, and it's not the math we're going to be working with today. Traditional biomechanics models the body as a machine, and it's very typical of humans to want to nail down exactly what's going on with things. That includes our internal dynamics and mechanics. We would like everything to stay still so we can analyze it, even though we know that living things never stay still. So, in that way, it's sort of like we're trying to pin the butterfly. It may have its applications and uses and value, but it may also not be the way to most completely understand something. And here's that picture of the arm I was telling you about. It really looks a lot like the diagrams from 1680. And in traditional biomechanics, it's really like this thing in human nature that we crave this static determinacy. We want to be able to make this exact determination, even though we know that some things may be indeterminate. As humans, we like to measure, even when we know that something is unmeasurable. So just keep this in mind as we go forward, because tensegrity has a different kind of math. We look a lot at triangles. It's not about numbers and calculations. It's about the geometry. And it's the geometry of minimal energy structures, which we know all living things are going to be minimal energy structures. And it's the geometry of movement. And specifically, we look at these closed kinematic chains in terms of the movement. So even this concept of closed kinematic chains, and this is a closed chain linkage system that you're seeing here, designed by Keishiro Ueki from Ryukoku University in Japan. Just really beautiful work that this guy is doing that we've been looking into a lot lately. So when we're looking at these closed kinematic chains, it's sort of compelling us to take a little sidestep here, a little short digression, because we need to look at the concept of kinematic chains versus kinetic chains. Okay? So, a short digression, kinetic chains versus kinematic chains. Here we go. The root of both of these words, kine, K-I-N-E, comes from the Greek word for movement. Kinetic energy is the energy that an object has when it's in motion, due to its motion. So you take a piece of paper, you crumble it up, you throw it across the room, and as it's flying through the air, it has kinetic energy. That's what kinetic energy is. Has to do with motion. Kinematics, different word. It has to do with the geometry that allows the motion, the geometry of pure motion, they say at Cornell University. It's about the structures that allow these movement possibilities. But the terms have become confused. Okay, kinematic chain mechanisms inspired the kinetic chain concept. Franz Reuleaux, back in the late 1800s, wrote this book, Kinematics of Machinery, and there are some beautiful mechanisms that you can find of these 4-bar linkages and more than 4-bar kinematic linkages. And so a lot of work was being done in this machine age with these kinematics. Now, inspired by this, in the middle of the last century, an orthopedic surgeon at the University of Iowa, Arthur Steindler, thought, let's bring this concept into the body. And he wrote Kinesiology of the Human Body and several other books, and he took the kinematic chain concept and developed the kinetic chain concept. Okay, now here's the problem. As he did this, and this is just a little blurb from the National Strength and Conditioning Association, but I think they've done a pretty good job here. As Steindler did this writing about these kinetic chains he was envisioning in the body, he used the term kinetic borrowing or inspired by the term kinematic that engineers use, and he used them interchangeably. So he's appearing to be talking about the same thing. Kinetic chain is not a term you'll find in engineering or robotics. They use the term kinematic chain. But kinetic chain is used in exercise science, and then it's also used interchangeably in exercise science with kinematic chain. And here's an example. These words are from the Physiopedia website. And you'll see it says the kinetic chain, sometimes called the kinematic chain, etc., etc. So the confusion continues and it's ubiquitous. However, since we now know the difference, we can begin to correct the language and clarify the difference between the two in our usage. Kinetic chains, that's a concept used in exercise science. Kinematic chains, these are linkages that are studied in the field of kinematics, which is a branch of physics and classical mechanics, and the kinematics are concerned with the geometry of motion. That said, now that you know what closed kinematic chains are, I suggest you really get a feeling for it by making your own. You can do this with cardboard, brass fasteners, strings, straws, toothpicks, raisins, mini marshmallows. Just get some things together, make some kinematic chains, and play with them and feel the movement, and you'll be learning right through your fingertips. Here is a very common example of a fairly planar closed kinematic chain. This is called a pantograph. It can be used to draw something small, but a pen at the other side of the mechanism can create a larger identical image. And you can do it the other way. You could trace a large image and it would draw it onto a small piece of paper. So that's a fairly familiar example. And here's another one of Keishiro's linkage creations here showing a pantograph. And if you look, it's actually a different mechanical physical configuration from the pantograph in the previous picture. Okay, but what's happening here is the blue, you can draw a smaller image and then it creates a larger one. Or maybe you're drawing with the red pen and it's creating a smaller image. That's just one example of what a closed kinematic chain can do. And closed kinematic chains don't have to be 4-bar linkages, and they don't have to be planar. They can be more multidirectional, omnidirectional, as these items are. And we're going to take a look at how this can work in a more omnidirectional framework. So this is from the very nice people at the International Mathematical Union. And I suggest you see the whole film. It's on YouTube on their logo that's based on the tight Borromean rings. It's a really great film, not very long, but this is just a piece of it to give us a hint about these closed kinematic chains.
The motion that we are watching unfolds an octahedron to a cuboctahedron, keeping pyrotahedral symmetry. It was popularized by Buckminster Fuller as the jitterbug. In the middle, there is one additional stage with extra symmetry, an icosahedron. Highlighting the 6 extra edges of the icosahedron, we can let them follow along in the jitterbug. They become face diagonals of the cuboctahedron, and then internal diagonals of the next icosahedron. This configuration can be built as a rigid tensegrity framework, with struts along the green diagonals and springs or cables along the red triangle edges.
I just love watching that every time. So why are we looking at these? Well, we want to understand the movement of living things. Biotensegrity looks at all living organisms. And look at this wonderful Monstera plant time-lapse photography that Taya Aziz posted because she was inside with her plant for a month and a half. Wonderful movement. This is the kind of movement we want to understand, and we're wondering how looking at closed kinematic chains, CKCs, can help us with this. Now, although closed kinematic chains have been studied for a long time, they really haven't been looked at comprehensively in the field of biology from our perspective. And we can see that these CKC configurations can create a wide variety of outcomes. Okay, an action in one part creates coupled simultaneous movement throughout the system. So if you look, this whole thing is turning around that little black dot. You see 3 black dots at the bottom right there, and the one on the right is the one that everything's sort of turning around, like that's the hub of that wheel. You'll see condensation, spiral unwinding, filling out. This is the kind of movement we're trying to understand. And there are other abilities and behaviors that we're looking at CKCs to help us get a clue about. And this clip is from National Geographic Wild, and I apologize in advance to the vegetarians in the crowd.
The mantis unloads the ace up his sleeve. Hammer claws. His spring-loaded clubs strike 50 times faster than we can blink. For a moment, the surrounding water reaches the temperature of the surface of the sun. You heard that right. This crab is toast.
So a little video enhancement and slow-mo there for drama, but you get the idea. These are some of the other abilities and behaviors that we want to be able to understand the power and speed of what appears to be a spring-loaded system, but without any mechanical springs the way we think about them. And that's why we're looking at these CKCs. So in these CKCs, we can see the amplification of force and speed. It's the structure itself that guides and regulates the motion. And here's yet another of Keishiro's beautiful linkages. So you see how it's a very thin piece, and then that turns around that center point. It's actually over to the right a little bit, and that steady movement around ends up creating first a slow and then a whipping action. You can just imagine that translating into speed and power in a body. Let's look at another underwater friend, also from National Geographic Wild, the octopus.
The octopus. Imagine that you're an octopus, like this Cyanea here. Your body has no bones, none. And what that means is that you'd be able to go almost anywhere you want to. Even if you happen to be a very large octopus, a 600-pounder, say, you'd be able to squeeze yourself down so far you could pass through a passageway no larger than a quarter. Since you don't have air bladders or gas pockets that would crush or implode at great depths, you can live at the very, very bottom of the ocean, where there's 15,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. A human being exposed to that kind of pressure would implode in a split second.
And so here we see this ability to seemingly endlessly reconfigure while maintaining the energy efficiency that's necessary for any biological organism and without compromising its safety or the higher level systemic stability and integrity that it would need to maintain. So, this is what we are thinking of as an example of superstability. And here's a closed kinematic chain from Keishiro, showing us how these can go from a more condensed to expanded and spacious configuration. And all of these are just planar examples of the possibilities that are inherent in the geometry of motion, in the kinematics. Now, another problem we're hoping the closed kinematic chain study can give us insight to is sometimes we'll see something going on inside a living system and it will look just chaotic or random to us. So the question is it chaotic or is it highly ordered? So here's another linkage from Keishiro. And you're seeing these lines. To me, this looks fairly chaotic, fairly random. But if we begin to pan out, we see that movement that can appear random, that can appear chaotic, may actually be purposeful. And so here's what that really looks like. What appears as chaotic movement may actually be the result of a highly organized and energy efficient structure, and could actually be part of an organism optimizing itself to a task when it comes to biology. And so this is the sort of insight that we think the closed kinematic chain studies could help us with. So we're looking at these living structures doing all these things. We're asking ourselves, is it chaotic? Is it random? And here we have from Mike Tiska of the Tiska Lab at Vanderbilt University what he calls a lattice light sheet movie of actin dynamics in a living cell. Take a look at this stuff. It's just beautiful to me. And I'm going to say it again. What appears as chaotic movement may actually be, in terms of biology, and we know this about biological efficiency and studying evolution, this chaotic movement may actually be the result of a highly organized, energy efficient structure and could actually be part of an organism optimizing itself to a task. Beautiful stuff. Thank you, Dr. Mike Tiska. Now here's another one of Keishiro's mechanisms, and it's Wittgenstein's rod, which is a whole other fun thing you can look up if you'd like. But Leonid Bloom, who you saw pictured with Steve Levin in that earlier photograph of the Needle Tower, talks about how kinematic indeterminacy and superstability math is telling us that it's sort of like at the level of the skin, when you're trying to go in through there and imagine what's going on inside the body, you're kind of going into a black box where a given output is going to give you no clue as to what's going on in terms of what the internal workings are. We cannot determine the kinematics, so it's kinematic indeterminacy. So here we have it, two identical images. What's going on behind these blue rectangles? Is it the same thing? Is it different things? There's no way of knowing. And here's what's actually going on. And we're seeing two examples here from Keishiro of what could create that shape, that output. But in truth, there could be hundreds, there could be thousands, theoretically a limitless number of possibilities that could result in this same output. So this is that kinematic indeterminacy that we're talking about. The underlying internal kinematics cannot be determined. And we think this relates to many-to-one mapping that Graham and Steve and I wrote about in our closed kinematic chain paper from a little while back. And we think it relates to degeneracy and redundancy and other whole systems concepts that we're looking at in the body. So, time for some conclusions. CKC's closed kinematic chains are emergent phenomena within biology's tensed framework organisms, from viruses to vertebrates, as Steve wrote many years back at the beginning of his work in the early 80s. Apparent chaos may actually be a result of a system's superstability within its dynamic homeostasis. And here's a photo of a tensegrity in the wild that I stumbled upon in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the last year, built by Design Fugitives. Really beautiful piece. Leonid Bloom's black box concept tells us kinematic indeterminacy indicates that we cannot know all the workings behind a given movement outcome. So if you can imagine, this image was kind of covered with a net and you only saw that external framework created by the red lines, wouldn't be able to know what was happening inside. But it's that funny looking mass of black closed kinematic chains in the center and to the right there that's making this happen. In the body, there may be an incalculable number of endlessly transmutable and continuously reconfiguring, kinematically indeterminate CKC systems operating at multiple scale levels simultaneously. So one more time, in the body, there may be an incalculable number of endlessly transmutable and continuously reconfiguring, kinematically indeterminate CKC systems operating at multiple scale levels simultaneously. Thank you, Hugh Johnson, for that beautiful tensegrity structure there. And the mathematics of superstability and kinematic indeterminacy tell us that once you get inside the body, the mathematical formulas traditionally used in biomechanics for calculating the body's internal forces do not apply. Thank you to Jason Chris. I think this was a graduate project for him to make this huge, massive tensegrity structures interlinked outside at his school. And with that, we'll just take a peek at another Linkage from Keishiro. Just beautiful. And I'll leave you with this final thought. This is from Daniel J. Cohen of the Cohen Lab at Princeton. He says, time-lapse microscopy changed biology for me and made me change fields, to wit, our spinning tissue mandala of kidney tissues dancing for 2 days. So just taking a look at that, the machine modeling that we saw in Borelli's work maybe isn't giving us the best model that we need for trying to understand the mechanisms behind this kind of manifesting motion. Thank you very much, and I'm going to give you a peek at the references. There we go.